Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother Matriarch. My guest today is Linda Griffith, Professor of Biological and Mechanical Engineering at MIT and Director of the Center for Gynepathology Research in Boston. Linda is a leading world expert on endometriosis, our subject today. We spoke about her own experiences with the disease, why it's so poorly understood, the challenges of diagnosis, the impact on women and girls, and what the future of treatment might look like. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you find the conversation not just interesting, but also useful for anyone whose life has been impacted by this wretched disease. Linda, maybe we should start by talking about your personal experiences of endometriosis, because I think that that's really influenced your work. It's something that you've come to like later in your career, having been a bioengineer right beforehand. Why has endometriosis had such an impact on your life, both professionally and personally?
So I started having symptoms of endometriosis when I was very young, even before I started my period. If you look across young girls, a lot of them have terrible GI symptoms when they're around 11 or 12 and then go on to develop terrible period problems. So there's some fascinating things that are not very explored clinically yet. And then this progressed. And because of the chaos of having to go home from school, when I would have my period in high school, the driver's ed class would have to take me home because I would faint and throw up and do all these things that were, not very good. And I became very, very attached to my math and science classes as a result, because there was order, there was chaos, there was all this stuff going on. And math made me feel like I was in control of things. And so as I progressed through my school, I gravitated toward being an engineer. I'm also very problem solving. But the problems with endometriosis were not diagnosed because, of course, everyone has a period, and people who are outgoing and, I'm a little bit dramatic. I'm, practical, but also very expressive, you can be dismissed as you're just making a big deal out of nothing. And my younger sister had zero problems with her periods. And yet my mother was very sympathetic and there was no medication. So my mom would give me gin, like at 15, just stop, you're crying. Here's some gin, and,
Very old
this,
school.
yeah, this is not a great way to do things. And then in college, it continued to progress. I would miss exams or have to leave class and so on. So there was always this thinking that somehow I wasn't managing something. Then I went to grad school at Berkeley, and it got worse because I started dating someone who, I got prescribed birth control pills when I was 13 to try to control the symptoms. And then in California, this guy I'm dating says, that's not good to be on birth control pills. And so I went off of them, and I had my period every 23 days, and it was really heavy and really long, and I had to reschedule my qualifying exam. So there were multiple impacts on my life because so much of my time was spent organizing my schedule around, when I was going to have my period. And at least when I wasn't on birth control, I knew exactly when I would have it. So I could plan, months out that, oh, I can't do it at that time. And it just became like breathing to me to protect myself from scheduling anything during a very important during that time. But then, as I progressed and did a postdoc, I ended up marrying that guy who was not sympathetic. In graduate school, I got diagnosed with rejecting my femininity because I was majoring in chemical engineering. I rode a motorcycle. I taught karate. All of these things were, surely it just must be I'm rejecting myself that I don't want to have periods because I want to do all these guy things, And so he's now my ex-husband, was really upset that I was not, having a baby and all of these things because he couldn't understand I wasn't diagnosed with anything and I'm laying on the couch and, not able to wash the dishes and blah, blah, blah. So I eventually went to the doctor for every 6 months when I was in grad school, when I was a postdoc, and said, this pain is not normal. And there was a particular incident, the lab phone was ringing and it was on a shelf by my desk. And I had to turn to the side and just lift a phone up with my arm sort of behind my back, and I couldn't move like that. And somebody in the lab screamed at me, "Something's wrong with you if you can't answer the phone." I was like, "Yeah, there's something wrong with me, all right." So that's really the incident that made me go for 6 months, month after month. And I had an ultrasound finally, and they found a cyst. They said, "We'll do surgery. You'll go home that day. You'll be back at work in a day or two. It's really nothing." And then it turned out I didn't even wake up till the next day because I had very, very advanced endometriosis, and no one had ever mentioned it. So it was a relief because there's something that we know about. It was also terrible because there really wasn't any therapy. And so it's just then after that, it was all different kind of medications that I went on a anabolic steroid. I got very strong. I could run very fast. People would stop me and ask me who my trainer was because not even going to the gym, I just looked so muscular from taking Danazol. And then I went in a clinical study to take another drug that caused menopause, and I lost 12% of the bone in my spine. So it was just a series of very huge side effect drugs back in the 90s. And it was always having to hide it. You never talked about it. And my then husband was not believing it was real disease, and he treated it as though it was a decision I was making to go on this drug or that drug. And he got very angry that I didn't have a baby. So this was all very stressful because I started a faculty position, and at the same institution. He's at MIT and I'm at MIT, and it was just very stressful to manage this disease that no one could explain, how to control the pain I had, and the side effects of the drugs were just horrible. And so you just figure it out because doing science is great. I love my job, and I had a lot of very fun things to do at work, so you distract yourself with work. But so it continued for years, and then a number of things stimulated me to start doing research on it late in my career.
Mm. So when you were growing up, the term endometriosis has been around for quite a long time, right? But was it just not something that doctors had on their radar?
They did not have it anywhere on their radar. And here's a very interesting thing. Certainly they don't have it on their radar if you're below the age of 30. Okay. And it's so when I started at MIT, I started a job that was a position joint with Harvard Medical School. And there's a program that MIT and Harvard Med School have. And I got assigned to teach endocrinology at Harvard Med School with a team of clinicians. And I didn't know much about endocrinology, so they gave me this reference book, and the reference book had a chapter on endometriosis. And I should look up exactly what this says because it had this amazing quote about the patients. And I'm going to pull this up and read it exactly from the textbook because I could not really believe it. It said, okay, this was a book published in 1989, which is the year after I was accidentally diagnosed. So the book says, and I quote, "The typical patient with endometriosis will be a nulliparous patient in her late 20s or early 30s. Textbooks describe her as intelligent, egocentric, over-anxious, and a perfectionist."
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. So that is a that is what we call a diagnosis bias. The other, so highly educated people who were very persistent were getting
Yeah.
diagnosed. So I got
Yeah.
diagnosed when I was 28, and I certainly met some of those criteria, and people who work with me can tell you about the others, but certainly I was highly educated. The other characteristics, if you go back to the old literature, is very interesting, is that patients are thin. And I was actually very thin in graduate, younger. And there are negative, epidemiological studies back in that era. There's a negative correlation with BMI. So thinner women, endometriosis actually was associated with thinner women. But
Interesting.
the fact that clinicians, this is the classic textbook for endocrinology, that clinicians are being trained out of this, and these people are still practicing today. So they're not going to see a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old and think endometriosis. And so
Mm.
a lot of what I do together with colleagues since I started doing research on this in 2009 is to raise awareness that it's actually a pediatric disease. It's actually a disease that starts in early adolescence, and we should have it much more on the radar screen, because unless we're studying these patients, we're not going to find ways to really treat the disease before the horse gets out of the barn.
Your actual classic patient is an adolescent teenage girl who starts her period. It's horrendous, but she knows nothing else. And she's
Right.
heard that periods are painful and heavy and difficult and whatever, and she thinks, oh, okay, well, I guess this is my life now. And then she doesn't actually get the knowledge and the help until maybe much further down the track, if at all.
Yes. So the published literature says the average time to diagnosis is 7 to 10 years. I
Wow.
think there's a lot more awareness now than there was back in the day because of social media, and because there's a lot more patient advocacy groups. And there's certainly, these things feed each other. For example, Padma Lakshmi, who is a model and a TV star. She was on a show called Top Chef, and many people know her. She was married to Salman Rushdie for a while. She started a foundation with the surgeon who diagnosed her endometriosis, and she'd had surgery for problems and they didn't even see it. And then she had surgery with a guy in New York named Tamer Sejkin, and she was finally diagnosed. And so she started the Endometriosis Foundation of America in 2008 or 2009 to with an agenda to raise awareness among young girls. And they do a lot of outreach to high school. They've gotten funding from the state of New York to do training of high school nurses and what you should do and how to recognize it and who to go to. So she made a huge commitment, and she actually had a huge influence on my own efforts to raise awareness and do research in endometriosis, because it's a lot of time to do that. And she spent a huge amount of her personal time to create this foundation. And it's a very influential foundation. They have a conference every year that I go to, and it's been a really, really helpful thing because they bring surgeons and scientists together.
Mm.
So I think there is a lot more effort now. And then there's the World Endometriosis Society, and the most recent past president, Stacy Mismer, who's a collaborator of mine, has had a special mission of raising awareness. And she has a study called the Adolescent to Adult, where she takes samples and studies patients who are pediatric, because there's focus in Boston at Brigham and Women's on pediatric endometriosis. So she's done a lot to raise the bar on research on these patients. And she did that with money from a donor. So it was not federal money, it was money from a philanthropy.
Yeah.
So there's increasing awareness, but I'm still continuously shocked at how huge pockets are not aware. It's shocking. For example, I am now getting inundated with interest from venture capital and other investors, which is good, who are thinking about investing in startups having to do with endometriosis. And I'm thrilled that this is the case. And I recently went to lunch at one of these places where they have MDs on their boards and so on in their teams. And I was stunned at how primitive the knowledge about endometriosis was among people who have MDs in this space. They're inviting me as an expert, and I thought, oh, I'm going to talk about the latest and greatest that I heard at the World Congress. No, I'm going to go down to the very, very, very basics of the disease. And at pharma, big pharma companies, I go and people are very surprised to hear. So of course I've lived in this space for, my physical life a long time, but in my professional life of over 15 years. So I'm very knowledgeable, but I'm still stunned at how primitive, the understanding is around people who are scientists or MDs. And I would
Mm.
think would know a little bit more than they do.
This episode is sponsored by Relay, one of those brands that's just such a perfect fit with MMM. I think what they're doing is excellent. Relay is an app that helps people stop using porn. And let's be honest, porn is basically everywhere on the internet. Most men see it first as teenagers. It quietly becomes part of life. But over time, it leaves a mark. You're more distracted, less present, less patient. It eats away at integrity, makes secrecy feel normal, and creates distance in your relationships. Many men feel stuck in the cycle, ashamed, frustrated, and wondering if change is even possible. That's where Relay comes in. It's therapist accredited and built on solid therapeutic principles, but the real difference is that you're no longer fighting alone. Relay places you in a private group with other men on the same journey, giving you daily accountability, encouragement, and tools to handle triggers whenever they pop up. You can stay totally anonymous while getting the real support you need to build a life of integrity. It's about becoming the husband, the father, the man that you were meant to be. Relay has already transformed the lives of thousands of men and the lives of their partners. Don't let the pattern continue. You don't have to stay stuck. Go to joinrelay.app/Maiden and use the code Louise, that's all capital letters Louise, to try it out for free. That's joinrelay.app/Maiden. So, two questions that are related to one another. One is, how do we diagnose it nowadays? So, for you, it had to be literally open up your uterus and have a look. Do we have a better way of testing for it? And then, relatedly, do we know how common it is? Can we estimate prevalence?
First, clarification. So endometriosis is outside the uterus. So they don't open up the uterus. They open up your, they go in.
Sorry, yeah, because they were going to your ovary.
So that is still the gold standard for diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
There's intense activity to do better imaging to diagnose it. I'd say by and large, it's often diagnosis by symptoms. So patients who have classic symptoms, as I had, and it's shocking that no one ever mentioned it to me before I had surgery because I had the classic symptoms. But patients who have classic symptoms will go, and the first line of treatment is to give them a progestin, some kind of birth control pill that will suppress estrogen. So endometriosis is believed to be driven by estrogen. Now, there's a lot we don't know about the role of estrogen, but if you give a progestin, many patients will feel better and they'll have their symptoms controlled. So women who have, menstrual pain associated with the cycle, not associated with it, because you can have mid-cycle pain, terrible cramps, heavy bleeding. A lot of patients will feel better and be okay, and they'll manage, and it'll be acceptable to them. Or you give them something like an IUD that's a progestin, like a Mirena, and their symptoms will be controlled. And I will make a clarification here that endometriosis has a sister disease called adenomyosis, and that is when there are lesions inside the muscle of the uterus. So it's not technically termed endometriosis, and there's a lot of debate about the similarities and differences, but both are characterized by tissue that has appearance of the endometrium growing ectopically, meaning not where it should be, and that's in the lining of the uterus. And so adenomyosis can also cause horrible symptoms similar and even, in fact, identical to endometriosis. And you asked about the prevalence of endometriosis. The classic numbers in many, many publications are about 10% of women. And I know I'd wandered off the diagnosis part, but I just wanted to mention the prevalence because it is subject to how you actually definitively diagnose. And part of the problem in using a symptom-based diagnosis, which has been done, is that adenomyosis has not been studied because you do not see adenomyosis if a patient has surgery for endometriosis. So in my case, they could find enormous amounts of endometriosis all over my intestines, yada, yada. But it also was in the wall of my uterus and they didn't see it because that's just not, they don't open that up. And so the approaches to image these lesions are getting better. And you can image the uterus, and everybody knows you can see fibroids. Most women over the age of 30 have some kind of fibroids, or 40 have some kind of fibroids, and some they get really huge. They can cause, bleeding. But adenomyosis has different signatures, and there's not the precision to see it by imaging. So there's still some lack of clarity in diagnosing a patient with adenomyosis. So the imaging for endometriosis has gotten better. If you have a cyst on the ovary, there's certain features that one could say are very consistent. There's better ability to see lesions that are in the bowel or certain parts of the bowel or on the uterosacral ligament. So certain locations and certain lesion features are now becoming more and more well described, and more clinicians are able to identify them in ultrasound or MRI images, or combinations of ultrasound and MRI. So you can do I'm pretty sure this patient has endometriosis because of her imaging, and she's got these features on her images, but that's not definitive. And then there's also most 70% of patients with endometriosis that is surgically confirmed have well, I don't want to say early stage. I will say their lesions are small and located around the peritoneum, the lining of the abdomen, in a way that you don't see it on imaging, or you need an extremely sophisticated imaging team who has techniques that are not commonly used to see them. So 70% of patients about have lesions that are difficult to see, if not impossible to see by standard imaging. So you're not going to see it by imaging. And so that leaves us with, is there a blood test? Is there some other kind of, urine test and blah, blah, blah. And the answer is nothing that really has passed muster that the whole community really can get behind. And there are things coming on the market, and we'll see if they really hold up. But there's a lot of great work in that space, but I'd say we're still a ways away from having it be useful for the average patient. And even if you have a test that says, okay, you have endometriosis, what does that even mean? Because patients are going to have different responses. 70% of patients have stuff that can't be seen on imaging very easily. The blood tests are still, I'd say, highly experimental, and it's exciting to think there would be a blood test. I think the nature of the disease doesn't give me great confidence we'll get specificity, especially because the clinical actions you will take if there's a blood test that says, yes, you have endometriosis, how would it change for the patient? I think the biggest thing would be to say that insurance would cover you would get to go to the next step to have surgery and so on, because a lot of in the US insurance companies, you need to have some kind of thing to go to the next step, and in the UK you may get further ahead in the NHS queue, which is very, very long for a lot of patients. So what would the blood test say? That what we really love to have in a test would be saying the patient would respond or not respond to a certain drug, because a huge fraction of patients do not respond well to the first line treatment. So you give them a drug like an igestin, a birth control pill, and they have side effects. Their symptoms don't improve. Their symptoms may get worse, all of these things. Then you progress and you cycle them through different pills. They don't respond. Finally, they decide, okay, I'm going to go on a menopause drug. And the menopause drugs have a lot of side effects. Some patients can tolerate them, and that's great, but a lot of patients can't. You can develop memory lapses, sleep disturbances, all these kinds of things. So then the patient will have surgery potentially, and then you have to manage the patient after surgery with, so there's right now the diagnostics are not gating the patient to a therapy that is for sure going to help them. And the blood tests, because they're not linked to any mechanism of disease. So you think, like, when I had cancer, I've had breast cancer twice, and the first time I was stunned because I found a tumor myself in Singapore, and I got home 3 days later and had a biopsy, and within 2 days, I knew I was something called triple negative. So there were three markers: estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, and a growth factor receptor called HER2. And I was negative for all of those. And so that gated the therapy I would have. So that those markers were linked to the mechanism of my tumor, the prognosis, which unfortunately is not so good for triple negative, and then the therapy, which is like you have a big old chemo and so on. But it struck me that we had nothing like that for endometriosis. And this was right when we were starting to do work. So it was extremely informative to go through this breast cancer process because, number one, I was immediately within less than a week of finding the tumor myself in a foreign country halfway around the world, I was immediately diagnosed with a particular kind. And my whole year of my next year was already planned out for me, that I'd have surgery, I would have chemo, I would have radiation, and then, get better. And I had an unusual situation, and I was on the front page of the New York Times because of some ambiguity in one of the tests. But still, there was so much information. I could just feel okay about what was happening because I could read enormous number of studies, and there was standard of care. And not only that, I was on sabbatical when it happened, which is terrible because you want your sabbatical to be
Waste your sabbatical, yeah.
but my dean automatically gave me an extra term of sabbatical so that I could recover from chemo. And I needed that. And people brought me food. They came over to my house and walked me around. They always told me I'd look great. They bought me presents. So, in other words, I was pampered and I could get through this. But my endometriosis, I had an emergency hysterectomy on 9/11 in the US. I ended up in the MGH emergency room. And that was a crazy day because they thought they were going to get all these patients from New York. And I had to have an emergency hysterectomy a few days later. I was teaching a class that people needed to graduate. And so I was back teaching. I ran our department retreat 10 days later, and I was back teaching right away. Now, if I'd had a baby, I would have gotten the whole term off. But you have this huge procedure, and nobody. I ran the department retreat laying on the floor most of the day because I was still in a lot of pain, and nobody knew what was going on.
Speaking of the New York Times, have you listened to the podcast series, The Retrievals, the first season of it?
No, I haven't.
You should. It's a hit, and it's completely merited. It's fantastic, and it's really like edge of. I don't know how they do it, but it's like edge of your seat stuff for something that's a piece of investigative journalism. So it's about a Yale IVF clinic where one of the nurses was stealing fentanyl and replacing it with saline for
Oh,
a period of many months. Yeah, she ended up going to prison
I've
for it.
heard of this saga, but I
Yeah,
haven't heard the podcast.
yeah. So the series is about how this came to happen and the court case and everything, but it's also about the fact that something like 200 women went through the egg retrieval process unanesthetized, because what they did in this clinic was they used a combination of fentanyl and they also used a sedative, and the sedative generally was working, but the fentanyl obviously wasn't because it was saline. And these women were saying, I'm in a lot of pain, including women who'd been through retrievals before, knew what it was supposed to feel like, anesthetized, and were saying, I can feel everything. I'm stone cold sober. This is really painful. And all of these hundreds of women were disregarded, is basically what happened. And it's a fairly amazing story about how routinely women's pain relating to their reproductive organs basically is not taken seriously.
It's extremely common to have women's pain ignored. And what got me diagnosed and finally was someone told me, and I can't remember because I did my postdoc with a liver transplant surgeon. So I was in a clinical setting, and he was an amazing guy. And there were all these residents and so on. And they were sympathetic, a lot of these people. And they said, well, you should go see your doctor during your period because women don't go to the doctor during their periods, or at least they didn't used to. And the reason for that is that people don't really have a good memory of pain. And so if
Mm.
you go through a really painful experience, it's very easy to talk you down. And so you go in the middle of your cycle, and then it wasn't that bad, or it couldn't have been that bad, and you're like, okay, I'm a good doobie, it wasn't that bad or whatever. And what really saved me was that memory that's like, no, it was this bad. I could not do this. I could not just turn slightly in my seat and lift my arm because that made me cry. That's how bad it was. And I'm sorry, this is not normal. And somebody in lab screamed, something must be wrong with you. And I'm like, yes. And that was the signature thing because he could not talk me out of how awful that pain was so that I could not do a simple thing. And so this is endemic. And I think what happens is people who experience the pain can be sympathetic. I mean, I'm very sympathetic. I teach at a very high pressure school, and I have helped countless young women get an extension and take an exam at another time, because I had to do this. I mean, I wasn't allowed to do it. I couldn't talk to anybody, but I can, write the professor, because I, as a professor, can write another professor and say, I think this student needs to take the exam tomorrow or whatever. But the people who don't have, other women can be among the most dismissive. And
Mm.
it's really awful. What really pushed me into starting my research center was the experience of my niece, which is recounted in, all my public talks and things, where she's 30 years younger than me. She had exactly my high school experience. Exactly. I mean, the symptoms day by day of her period would be exactly the same. And her female OBGYN put her on birth control pills when she was 13 and she didn't get relief. And she had a particular symptom that involved GI bleeding that's very characteristic of I call the doc, I tell the doctor, I think she had, the doctor says she's got a GI problem. And I sent her for food allergy tests and then colonoscopy. I was like, I don't think she needs a colonoscopy. I think she needs to be evaluated for endometriosis. And the doctor chewed me out. And, so she has colonoscopy, comes back negative. And the doctor tells my sister, your daughter is making everything up to get out of going to school. And, my sister and I are really not the same at all. She majored in journalism and so on, but her daughter was like my child, like mini me, and she loved school. She was a top student in her school. She hated missing school. And so I got her referred to a surgeon in Atlanta where she was living. And when she was 16, she had stage 3 endometriosis.
Mm.
Okay. And so this just made lava shoot out of my head, because her female OBGYN argued with me that I wasn't there. I didn't, she tells me, I don't know what's going on with this patient. And I'm like, and then I was right. And so here we have a big problem. When I started my research center, MIT was not what I would call supportive. Individual faculty, yes. Huge number of colleagues came out of the woodwork to volunteer to help with projects. But the administration, not so much. And this was a time when there was a lot of activity at MIT and certain other schools, but MIT was a ground central around women in STEM, the women in science study that Nancy Hopkins would. And I start this center and I'm doing these educational things, outreach events and so on, had Padma Lakshmi come up. And I have, really high power women come to me and say, we really don't want you to be saying these things because men will think we are weak.
Mm.
And I was like, there was not support from the main MIT. Things like fundraising, I would have donors want to give me money, and MIT would, direct the money to other places. And there was a sense that going public with how prevalent and how debilitating these problems are would make women in general look, weak. And it's like, well, men have, if they see stuff, they live with women, and they actually are very sympathetic. When they learn about these problems, they have ideas of how they can help with their expertise. And I think it's great that we're doing this, because we're getting a lot of help to shed light on these terrible problems. And, so it's an interesting, it's just an interesting landscape of how we navigate the who does and doesn't support this whole idea that women are suffering.
This is not the end of the episode. Actually, we're only halfway through, but the rest of the show is behind a paywall. In the extended version, Linda and I spoke about why cancer treatment is often far better than endometriosis treatment, why prevalence may be far higher than we realise, and the complicated effect that the disease has on fertility. While you can, of course, listen to MMM wherever you get your podcasts, the true home of the show is to be found at louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can find not only the extended version of this episode, but also the extended versions of hundreds of MMM podcasts, plus the weekly bonus episodes I record with other Substackers, including Rob Henderson, Megan Murphy, Nina Power, Mary Harrington, Ed West, and more. This is a listener-supported podcast. I am utterly reliant on paid subscribers to produce the show and keep the lights on. If you find Maiden Mother Matriarch valuable, the most helpful possible thing you can do is go to louiseperry.substack.com and sign up to become a paid subscriber for either $8 a month or $79 a year. Without paid subscribers, I really wouldn't be able to produce the podcast. So if you're willing to join their ranks, this is the key way that you can support me and support the show. Thank you.